Dr. Pete Maxfield. I'm the program leader for the environmental science program, also at UWE Bristol. But I'm also going to talk to you today about the wildlife ecology and conservation science degree. And both degrees run in the same department, the School of Applied Sciences. So yeah, my name is Pete Maxfield. I'm the program leader for environmental science. Paul Lintott couldn't be with us today. He's actually at a re-accreditation event with Bristol Zoo for the wildlife ecology program. So I'm going to also talk through that program because they share quite a lot of features between the two. Okay, so obviously we're based down in the southwest of England in Bristol, as we've already discussed. The School of Applied Sciences sits within the College of Health, Science and Society, and we actually have 5 main undergraduate programs. And so we share some features with the biological science program also, and also the environmental science shares a little bit with forensics. But the two courses kind of run side by side. They also are fed into by staff that work across a range of research groups, including the Centre for Research in Biosciences, Biosensing, the Science Communication Unit, and also quite a lot of technological development links very closely with what a big research group that's shared between UWE Bristol and the University of Bristol, the Bristol Robotics Laboratory, which is based on site here at Frenchay campus. The degrees also work closely with other partners like the Bristol Natural History Consortium and also Bristol Zoological Society based at Bristol Zoo Project. And whilst I'm not primarily going to talk about it today, we do actually also offer a third degree. If you're particularly interested in the conservation side of ecology, we offer a foundation degree in integrated wildlife conservation, which runs at Bristol Zoo Project for the first 2 years. And then the final third top-up year is up at UWE Bristol. So just briefly, a bit about the Bristol Zoological Society. So they're based just to the north of Bristol now, at the Bristol Zoo Project. This is one of the kind of new areas they developed called Bare Wood, and it's to kind of integrate conservation within the natural landscape. So this is an enclosure where there's shared wildlife, things like bears and wolves, sharing space, trying to recreate what they would look like in the natural system. They're also actively working across the world on a range of conservation projects, and some of our students get to work on these projects in their final years as their sort of research dissertations, and I'll come back a bit more about that later. Just to mention, yeah, so we share a number of degrees with Bristol Zoo Project. So the integrated wildlife conservation, wildlife ecology, those are the two I'm going to talk about today. We also offer 3 different shared master's projects with them as well. So we work very closely between the two organisations. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 degrees today. So the environmental science program, which I lead. So this is just the structure of the program. So there is actually a foundation year which runs across the whole department for students who have lower qualifications on entry. And then the full first year has 4 compulsory modules. These are covering kind of the basics of science, really. So in terms of maths, statistics, planning, how to do experiments, how to be an environmental scientist, the field skills module underpins that. The Earth then underpins the kind of physical sciences, life on Earth, the biological sciences, and then environmental society then relates that kind of core scientific teaching to how we would then manage those issues in the wider society, maybe a bit more towards what the geography degree that you heard about would be looking at a bit more extensively. And then in the second year, then you get a lot more module options. So there'll be 2 compulsory taught options and then a range of options to choose. And you can kind of start to tailor your degree depending on the sort of subjects in environmental science that you're interested in, whether you're interested in more kind of the ecology side or the plant sciences side, or whether you're more interested in the physical sciences side. You can choose modules accordingly. And then in the final year, a couple of compulsory taught modules. You then do a large dissertation project, research project, and then again, a range of options which you would choose from to tailor your degree to what you're interested in or where you want to head after you've finished your program. So yeah, just to highlight a bit more details about the first year module. I'm not going to go through this for all years because it'll be very, very lengthy. But as I mentioned, life on Earth covers the biological sciences. So we have sort of 4 key components we look at in that. So you look at ecology and evolution and how life started on Earth. We look at microbiology, we look at plant sciences, and we look at animal sciences. Those are kind of the 4 disciplines we introduce. The Earth is similar. I think we look at 6 core topics. So we look at atmospheric science and global warming. We look at the energy transition. We look at sort of geology and resources. We look at soil science and soil health. We look at the marine system. And then we finish by looking at the biosphere and how all those things are integrated in terms of life. As I mentioned, field skills underpins kind of that core development of skills you need to be an environmental scientist. We also have a field trip associated with that module, a bit like the geography courses. There's field trips at all levels. I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. And then the Environment and Society module looks at things like global environmental challenges, sustainable development, environmental economics, policy, legislation, all those sorts of things. The Wildlife Ecology program, why is that not changing? Ah, there we go. It's very similar at the first year. It has 3 of the same core modules and then just has 1 different option. So we've designed it so you can switch between the 2 programs up until the end of the first year. So the first years are quite similar, and it's after that that the courses diverge more. So the only difference in the first year is the Wildlife and Society module. And this module is taught by staff from Bristol Zoo. So it's much more conservation focused, much more led by the conservation scientists at Bristol Zoo. And they teach 1 module at each level of the program. So this is the overall structure for the Wildlife Ecology program. So I'd say the first year is quite similar, except for this 1 module. In the second year, there are a couple of shared modules between the 2 programs, but the main differences here is so the Conservation in Practice module is taught again by staff from Bristol Zoo, and then some bespoke ecology modules. And then in the third year, the Contemporary Conservation Science module and the Primate Ecology and Conservation Science module. Those are taught primarily from staff linked with Bristol Zoo. So just to put up both programs side by side. So you can see there are about 50% shared, but then it diverges as you go through the degree. These are some of the core teaching staff that teach across both environmental science and wildlife ecology and conservation science. So staff, so people like Steph and Freya, very much looking at water, microplastics, marine science research. Our key ecologists, Mark Steer, Jim Vafidis, Paul Lintott, very much focused on things like urban ecology, how to integrate agriculture and sustainable practice to preserve the environment. And then a couple of staff that have actually come from Bristol Zoo, so Mark Abrams and Amy Oxley used to be conservation scientists at the zoo, and they lead more international focused projects, looking at conservation across the world. Buffy and Bethan are our key kind of wildlife ecologists, and Angelina Sanderson-Bellamy is a sort of food scientist and looking at food policy and sustainable agriculture. Those are kind of the key teaching staff. In terms of facilities on site, so we have a really good range of labs. So we're in the science department. So we have, I think, about 5 or 6 large teaching labs, which take up to about 60 students. And we're able to share a lot of the key analytical equipment with some of the other programs, which means we're able to run a lot more different types of lab sessions. So this is one of our analytical labs here. So we have things like infrared spectroscopy, mass spectrometry, different types of chromatography for looking at things like water pollution, things like herbicides and pesticide analysis, those sorts of things. And the students would have typically a couple of lab sessions every week, or field or local fieldwork sessions where they'll do similar sorts of techniques, but then either go out into the field and apply them there or bring samples back to the lab to analyze. And I guess if you're trying to differentiate what's the difference between the geography courses you've heard about and the environmental science program, you know, the broad subject areas are very similar. You'll probably have realized that. I guess the main differences will be looking more at sort of smaller scale things, probably a bit more, so more bottom up, looking in a bit more detail at processes right down to the micro level potentially, whereas geography maybe are looking more from top down at bigger things. But maybe we could talk about that in the questions afterwards. We also have some really high-end analytical equipment. So this is a scanning electron microscopes that's looking at, you know, sort of sub-micron, nanometer scale processes. We use this for things like developing microbial fuel cells and sensors for detecting trace elements in the environment, those sorts of things. And we have a lot of plant science research in the department as well. So we have a bespoke kind of growth facility, fully environmentally controlled conditions and so on. Similar to the other programs, between the second year and third year, you can take a placement year. This is optional. Usually up to about 20% of the cohort will go out on placement in any given year. So that's probably up to about 10 students. Normally in a year, we have about 40 students on the program for environmental science. And then for wildlife ecology, slightly larger programs, that's about 60 students. And on that, probably slightly more, maybe up to a quarter. go out on placement there. These are some environmental science placement locations that students have been to recently. We always get really positive feedback on our students. And often actually, if we have a successful placement student, we'll be able to send more students there in following years. So we don't guarantee to find students placements, but we have lots of opportunities we can share with you for doing that. A few placement locations for wildlife ecology students last year. So slightly different focus, tend to be often slightly more international, a range of projects all over the world that students can help out and get involved with. As I mentioned, a key feature will be the final year dissertation projects. This is a quarter of your final year. And this can be based either in the field where you would collect data or in the lab, or sometimes it might be more of a data analysis project. So again, some recent project titles of some environmental science students I've been supervising over the last few years. But these can be very much, microbiology projects. It could be plant science projects. So what I'm going to do is just go through some of the research briefly that a lot of our staff are involved with, not because you'll necessarily be going out on these projects, but you may want to get involved with them as part of your final year project. So one big research project we've had running is out in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So this is Professor Neil Willey, and he's been looking for long-term changes of the impact of that nuclear disaster on the ecology and the plants and the restoration of the exclusion zone. We have a new project just starting up, actually, an EU project developing hydroponic systems and linking it with a lot of the microbial fuel cell research going on in the university. So can you use the nutrients from the fuel cells and the energy to drive plant growth in internal systems? We have a lot of work out in Africa looking at plant diseases. So this is focusing on cacao swollen shoot virus. And actually developing sensors for detecting this disease, whether that's handheld or actually we've actually got a couple of PhD students that we're working on. Can you detect these from above, from the air using drone technology? We have some marine science research out in looking at blue carbon in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean. We have a very long research project running with the University of Havana in Cuba, and this is linked with one of our final year field trips. So this has been going for about 15 years. Marine biology research. We have some research going on in the Arctic Ocean. So one of our members of staff, does a lot of research looking at the impact of climate change on Arctic systems. And similarly, we've had some students go up to Abisko in northern Sweden. So this is linked with the Science Communication Unit, who we work closely with, communicating the impacts of climate change, where the impacts are being much more strongly felt than maybe further south. It's much more accelerated issues up in the Arctic system. We do a lot of water science research and a big project working out in India, looking at water quality along the River Ganges. And we also have a lot of work looking at building applied systems for actually treating water and improving water quality. And these are being deployed all over the world using the latest technologies. A lot of research into microplastics and looking particularly at ecotoxicology in UK rivers. In terms of our more sort of UK conservation projects, we do a lot of work on urban wildlife and the impacts of urban systems on key species. So in the UK in particular, species like bats, impact of lights, temperature changes, human activity on these key species. We do a lot of agricultural research. So this is actually my project. So working down in Somerset, so it's about an hour south of Bristol. We have lots of carbon stored in the soils down there and looking at can we manage these landscapes to stop losing all that carbon to the environment, very much linked with the way we're changing to using carbon credits to manage landscape change. Quite an exciting new project looking at soil ecoacoustics. Can you monitor biodiversity using sound? And that's quite an advanced technique now in looking for birds and those sorts of things, but can you do a similar thing underground? We do quite a lot of research using drones. So this is actually mapping seabird habitats and nest sites and scrub. This is on a seabird colony just in the Severn Estuary, just near Bristol. And then this one's really interesting. So a bit like the one in Cuba, this is actually linked with one of our final year field trips. So we've been working for about 8 years now out in Madagascar, developing a protected area for some key lemur species out there. So this is both a conservation project, but actually a lot of the research is environmental science. So it's looking at sustainable agriculture in the system and providing ways that the local community can subsist without having to damage the habitat, which then is then obviously damaging the wildlife in the area. And so there is this real integration between, you know, it's often the same problem. So you might be interested in the animals and the conservation, you might be interested in the fundamental processes in the environmental science, but you need them both to deal with these challenges. So yes, you know, the key headline is the lemurs, but actually the way to fix that often is dealing with other issues in terms of the protecting the habitats and the ecology. So as I mentioned, we do have some field trips, a bit like the geography program again. So in the first year, we have a residential trip to Dartmoor. This is included in one of the compulsory modules, and therefore there's no additional cost. We go early in the year, so you'll get to know each other. We take over one large field centre for the week, and usually have about 60 students together. So we go up on the moor, we look at the rivers, we go down to the coast, start looking at marine science issues as well. Real just introduction to working as a university student, getting to know each other, starting to conduct field work. The residential trip in the second year goes to North Wales, an area called Snowdonia. It's very mountainous, but it's also on the coast. So this one's much more student-led. So after nearly 2 years of study, you're able then to start planning research projects yourself. So you'll have to actually, before you go, plan what you're going to study, what you're going to analyze, specify what equipment you need. We effectively take a whole lab setup with us. So we'll have microscopes, ovens, lots of analytical equipment for measuring chemical properties. And then you'll go out and collect the samples or study the things you want to analyze in the environment, or the species, collect the species, or use camera traps, those sorts of things. This is where we stay on the left. That's the view from the field centre, looking over Cadair Idris, which is one of the largest mountains in Snowdonia. And this is actually coming down Cadair Idris, looking at woodland, ancient woodlands. And then this is up on top of one of the mountains, and one of the students looking at a peatland system. And then in the final year, we have 4 different trips run, but they're linked with optional modules. So there is additional cost associated with them. So if you choose the marine ecosystems module, we have a field trip down to North Cornwall. Just a short trip, I think it's 4 days, and we stay on the north coast of Cornwall, and we look at the Camel Estuary, and we look at changes in the ecology right down the river. So looking at seabird populations, doing fishing, sampling for flatfish populations, looking at the fishing industry and the impact of that on this really delicate system. And then we have a tropical expedition and research expedition module, which has 3 trips that run every year. So one of those trips is linked with that research project out in Madagascar. So it's not just a trip, it's actually you're integrating with an ongoing research project with 2 partners who we've actually had over to UWE several times. So it's an ongoing research project. And what's really exciting is for every student we take on the expedition, we also fund a student from the University of Antananarivo. So you'll be working alongside Malagasy students in the field. So this is the field site here on the left, and this is a tree planting day with the local community and habitat restoration. We also run a marine biology trip. Now, this has been to Cuba for the last nearly 15 years. I think this, if you do come to UWE and go on this course, this is going to change, I think, just because of the way the situation in Cuba is changing. So we're currently looking at a new location for this trip. But currently it runs where you do half the trip, you'll be doing diving on coral reefs. And as part of that, if you don't have it already, you'll get your diving qualifications. And then the other half is looking at dry tropical forests and a lot of the species and issues associated with those ecosystems. And then recently we added a 3rd trip. This is both less costly. So those trips, the costs are quite high. They're sort of £2,500 to £3,000 for about a 20-day expedition. And to make that more accessible, we also now run a trip to Eastern Europe, to Macedonia and the mountains of northern Greece. Again, this is a long-term project. So one of our former members of staff has set up a scientific research station on the 2nd highest mountain in the area. And it's really exciting, actually, because it's a rare place in the world. It's a post-agricultural landscape. So the population is actually decreasing. And so wildlife are actually coming back in, and agriculture intensity has been decreasing. And it's almost like a pointer maybe towards the sorts of ways we would want to regenerate systems that have been depleted by overexploitation. So that's the sort of basis for that project. A few practical things to finish. So the degree has 12 hours of sort of taught contact time per week for 24 weeks across the year, split in 2 semesters. Typically, we run on a fortnightly rotation. So, for example, in the first year, if you have like the Earth module, which is the physical sciences module, 1 week you'll have a 3-hour lab, and then the next week you would have a 3-hour sort of lab, sort of class base, whether that's workshop and lecture, maybe 2 hours of lectures and then a workshop, something like that. And then similarly, the Life on Earth module will be the opposite. So the week you have the lectures in one module, you have a lab in that module, and then you'd have the lectures in that module the next week. In the first year, 60% of the marks come from coursework assessments and then 40% from controlled assessments. So that might be exams, but it might be things like presentations or other controlled assessments. And then in the final year, it sort of flips. So about 40% of the module marks come from coursework and then 60% from controlled assessments. Although this is changing. So actually a lot of modules now will be 50-50, or there might just be one large assessment for the whole module. There's an emphasis on all the assessments to actually assess things like lab skills, field skills directly, data analysis, and actually give you assessments that mimic the sorts of things you'd be doing in jobs, whether that's creating reports in terms of an environmental impact assessment or a flooding analysis or something like that, or in the science communication module, it might be creating a film or communicating the results of an experiment in a novel way. And these are all to develop your sort of generic and transferable graduate skills. As with all courses across university, there's a range of student support in place to support you. In terms of destinations, so I just looked on LinkedIn last week, and these are a lot of the students that have graduated from the 2 programs in the last few years, some of the sort of diverse range of places they've gone to. And you'll see there, yeah, they will, environmental science in particular leads to a whole range of different roles, very, very diverse. Whereas if you very much know you want to work in ecology and conservation, then maybe the wildlife ecology course will be much more specific for those roles. Not that you can't get into them with an environmental science degree, but that's kind of the options that you have if you come and join us. As mentioned by the geography talks, courses are very well rated by student satisfaction. So we often I've had 100% satisfaction in environmental science the past few years. And then last year, I think the key metric they were looking at was teaching. So we had 96%, which was really good. So hopefully I think I'm within time, maybe slightly under. But yeah, if you've got any questions now, I could definitely answer environmental science questions, and most of the questions hopefully to do with the wildlife ecology course. But also I've put Paul's email address there. So Paul Lintott, as I mentioned, is the program leader for wildlife ecology. So you could always email him directly if there's